Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and get, as folks are coming in, I'm going to go ahead and get set up this morning and kick off our lesson here, my second and final lesson. So just want to welcome everybody, and I'd like to go ahead and say off the top of the bat, at any point, if you guys have questions, comments, answers, concerns, gripes, praises, anything you want to let me know or send my way, please feel free to do that. And if you wouldn't mind, do it through the Q&A, the question and answer tab at the bottom of the Zoom screen. That would be helpful. So as we're getting going this morning, I'm going to take a quick look at one of the lectionary passages for this morning. I'm not going to spend as much time as I did last week in the lectionary itself, but I did want to just kick us off in that kind of meditative spirit, which if you tuned in last week, you'll know I'm kind of making a case that liberation theology itself represents a particular kind of style or way of doing theology that is in a real sense grounded in a meditative and contemplative approach to scripture, tradition, and history, human history. So I'm going to begin with a couple of scriptures this morning. One from the lectionary reading. Let's see if I can share this screen. Let me get some of these boxes out of the way. All right, so I spent a good bit of time in the lectionary last week, and then connecting that with a couple of biblical passages that I think are especially important for the task of liberation theology, both historically and in the present day context. So I'm going to go back through in a very brief fashion the specific text I was mentioning from the New Testament, Romans 12, and the Psalms, Psalms 9 and 10, and how I commented on those last week. But I did want to start us off in the lectionary with just one image from the text today. The Old Testament lesson from the book of Ezekiel is really laying out in a really surprising fashion, if you aren't, parallels between the gospel accounts of Jesus as the good shepherd and the historic roots of that theme and image in and narrative in the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures. So Ezekiel, the 34th chapter says, "Thus says the Lord God, I myself will search for my sheep and will seek them out." Pay attention to that. I myself will search for my sheep. When we start thinking about, in a few minutes with Gustavo Gutierrez, about the task of liberation theology itself as not really even a response of moral responsibility from us to certain people, but a response to God and God's own presence and activity. So the Lord God says, I myself will search for my sheep and will seek them out. As shepherds seek out their flocks when they are among their scattered sheep, so I will seek out my sheep. I will rescue them from all the places to which they have been scattered on a day of clouds and thick darkness. Notice that language of scattering being associated with that imagery of judgment. I will bring them out from the peoples and gather them from the countries. That the Hebrew word there is surely the nations or peoples, and will bring them into their own land. So a promise of a good belonging on earth together, an earthly promised land. And I will feed them on the mountains of Israel, by the watercourses, and in all the inhabited parts of the land. I will feed them with good pasture, and the mountain heights of Israel shall be their pasture. There they shall lie down in good grazing land, and they shall feed on rich pasture of the mountains of Israel. I myself will be the shepherd of my sheep, and will make them lie down, says the Lord. I will seek the lost, and I will bring back the strayed. And I will bind up the injured, strengthen the weak, but the fat and the strong I will destroy. I will feed them with justice. Therefore, says the Lord God, I myself will judge between the fat and the lean, between those who have too much and those who have not enough. So that's a decision of the Lord's judgment, the scriptures tell us. Because you have pushed with flank and shoulder and butted at all the weak animals with your horns until you scattered them far and wide. So there's a specific um, judgment being made here against specific historical actors who have caused the sheep to be scattered and who have put pressure and physical force to divide the flock, right? Because you have done this, use your might to scatter my sheep. I will save my flock, and they shall no longer be ravaged. I will judge between sheep and sheep. I will set up over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he shall feed them. He shall feed them and be their shepherd, and I, the Lord God, the Lord will be their God, and my servant David shall be prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken. So some really rich theological imagery there, just for the themes we were talking about last week, about God's own judgment uh, being tied to historical attention, historical presence, and awareness of suffering, of the division between humankind, the war and violence that the nations make in their own name, and this really strong imagery here of God's judgment being tied to what? Provision, right? The provision of an abundant uh, and livable human life, care for the sheep. So it's care, nurture, provision that is at the heart of God's judgment against the fat and the lean, the rich and the poor, the oppressor and the oppressed. And I think that's pretty key imagery here. I'm gonna have to reposition while we're getting the outside situation. Okay, so I don't want to say a whole lot more from the lectionary just because I don't want to spend too much time in the scriptures themselves. If you want to get a sense of how I connect these dots, feel free to look back at last week's lection where I spent a good bit of time in the lectionary and then a couple of biblical passages. But I did just want to say the lectionary does connect that imagery from Ezekiel of God being the good shepherd, the Lord providing and doing God's own shepherding, care and provision for God's children, and God's attentive judgment that discerns between the fat and the lean. Specifically, that idea that the judgment of God is tied to earthly provision, right? Food, shelter, nourishment, care. This is at the heart of the biblical story itself about who God is and who we are as human beings in ourselves and in relationship with others and with God. And the lectionary connects that theme to precisely these issues that liberation theology focuses upon. So we begin with the Old Testament imagery of God as a shepherd and a judge, making specific judgments for certain purposes. And the lectionary ends with the Gospel of Matthew. We're all familiar with the 25th chapter about the great judgment, right? Um, Come, you who are blessed to inherit the kingdom prepared for you, for I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. So I think just to mention quickly in passing as we get back into our lesson on liberation theology and Gutierrez, just note that this imagery here in the New Testament of the great judgment, um, we often think of this in perhaps moralistic or kind of legalistic ways, right? We don't really know how to apply this passage because it seems like works-based reward, right? God is punishing or rewarding those on the right and left for what they have done. But note that this is not a moral failing of what human beings have failed to do to other human beings, just as in the language of Ezekiel, right? The dividing line, right, between the faithful and the unfaithful, between those who tend to the presence of the Lord and those who are unaware or apathetic or hostile to the presence of God in our midst, right, is that we are actually responding when we respond to and engage with other human beings. We are responding to the presence of God, God's self, right? God's own presence and activity in history. It's not a moral failing, it's a theological failing that's being judged in Matthew 25, and that has its roots in the prophetic tradition of the Hebrew scriptures. What you do to the least of these, you do unto me. And as Gutierrez makes plain, which we're going to talk about here a bit more in just a minute, right? It's that identification of God's own self with the reality and hope of the poor, their life situation. It's God identifying with that in a specific way that makes a claim on everyone, rich and poor, oppressor and oppressed, the fat and the lean, those who have enough or too much, and those who have not enough, right? Who and again, it's not possession, but it's about being in relationship and having access to God's own presence and provision, right? A certain kind of access that respects the humanity of everyone involved. That's the central issue here that we see brought up in the lectionary readings for today. And again, this was not really planned, but as often happens, the lectionary um, speaks to us in ways that we weren't really expecting. So, okay, I'm going to stop that screen share, get back into our lesson. Just going to go ahead and check in the chat real quick. Hey. Okay, so as Nathan's reminded you guys in the chat, please, if you do have questions or comments throughout, just submit them. If you can through Q&A, I'll try to keep track of both chat and Q&A. But if you'll submit your questions and comments through Q&A throughout, then I'll try to note all of those. All right, bring up my slides here. Switch screens. Okay, so to get back into what we covered last week, just a brief overview. I'm going to be already commented a bit on the lectionary. We covered last week some of the historical roots of liberation theology. And just to go through that very, very quickly, we talked about the 50s and 60s, especially the mid-late 60s in Peru and Brazil with Gustavo Gutierrez and the emergence of Catholic liberation theology in Catholic dominant Latin American countries out of what's called the ecclesial-based communities, which I can say more about if anyone's interested about just the phenomenological or just social communities out of which liberation theology in Latin America emerged. And I also talked about what was going on connecting to the political and social situation in Latin America in the 60s and the emergence of liberation theology there with what's happening in the United States, with the prophetic work of the emergence of James Cone and his initial text, Black Theology and Black Power, in 1969, just after the assassination of Martin Luther King. I think Cone actually wrote Black Theology and Black Power, he says, in about 3 months, 3 months. So if you can imagine that kind of fiery energy, that's what was going on to begin after the wake of King's assassination, after Malcolm being killed, with ongoing police brutality and murder. And I'll say a bit more about the connection between Black theology of liberation and Latin American theology of liberation at the end. But there are international historical roots for the emergence of liberation theology, as I talked about last week, as a modern Christian response, a Christian response to specific historical realities and circumstances and conditions that happen about the same time in Latin America and in the US. And that's not just a feature of providence, that it happens in both places, these historical roots, although it may be a feature of providence, but if it is, it's providence working through, as I spoke about last week, an international, really political kind of awakening and social sensibility coming out of the long struggles for independence of colonized and oppressed peoples in the modern West. So feminism theology comes in quickly in as well in the late 60s as in dialogue with and as a critique of in some important ways kind of founding fathers, to be blunt, about the kind of male-centered origins of liberation theology. We'll talk about that towards the end when I get into some contemporary examples, but those are the historical roots of liberation theology, which we spoke about a bit last week, and which I encourage you all to go back and look at. The Bandung Conference in 1956, as this meeting of colonized peoples from Africa and Asia in the name of liberation and charting a new path forward. This is all in the air and part and parcel of the reality that liberation theology is responding to as a specific response. So I'm going to say a bit more today about the biblical and theological roots of liberation theology, getting us into Gutierrez, and talk about liberation theology itself as a kind of prophetic task in this specific historic circumstance in the modern age. And then look at some contemporary examples of liberation theology. And I'm going to make a few comments along the way about Gutierrez and really theological methodology, and try to connect that with his reading of the book of Job. Although, just for the audience's awareness, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the book of Job itself, just because you guys have been getting so much great material that you need to go back and look at on the book of Job, which ties seamlessly in with all of this stuff that I'm doing on liberation theology and Gutierrez the past few weeks. So check Dr. Vasely's great 2-week series before mine last week on the book of Job, and other resources. There was a lecture by William Brown recently at MTS that I hope you guys took note of as well. Okay, so we'll look at some contemporary examples in the half-century since the founding of liberation theology, and then I'll take some questions and comments towards the end and try to throughout as well. Just to recap some points we made last week, we looked at Miguel de la Torre's distinction between Christian liberation theology as the specific historical response in the 60s to the problem of the modern colonial West, and then liberative praxis or theology in general, which is this human rejection, moral, spiritual, existential rejection to the realities of modern oppression that liberation theology is part and parcel of, that wider social and political sensibility that says no to the dominant patterns and powers of the modern West. We talked about the story of Hatui. De la Torre pinpoints the beginning of liberative resistance in the New World through the figure of Hatui in January 1493. He was attempted to be converted by a friar, I believe a Dominican friar, who was trying to convert him on his at his execution, and Hitui's resistance. Right, I don't want anything a part of any god or religion that would do or justify this. Right. That reminds me, there's a great quote from the philosopher Hannah Arendt, where Arendt says that morality does not begin with saying I cannot or we should not, right? With making some judgment about some possible action that we should or should not do, and whether it's good or bad for us to do it. That's not the beginning or the root of morality. Arendt says morality begins subjectively, intersubjectively for us when we are confronted with a situation where in deep down in us, in our spirit, we say no, we say I can't, right? So that refusal, that recognition that a line has been crossed, and that the issue of our very humanity is at stake. That's the central core of what's going on in this liberative spirit that liberation theology picks up on in the 60s throughout the West. Okay, so some of the biblical roots of liberation theology that we talked about. I pointed out, again, I encourage you to go back and look last week, but the first couple of verses of Romans 12 talk about appealing to us, to followers of Jesus and the community, the ecclesia, the community of the gathered, by the mercies of God. We talked about the roots of the mercies of God, what God's mercy is, being tied to God's presence and purpose and judgment in the Old Testament. Us being appealed to present our bodies in a certain way in the world, and that this itself is our spiritual worship of God, right? This response out of the depths of our heart and mind and soul with all of who we are, right? To present ourselves a certain way, respond to God and history with a certain posture. And that posture is one of intentional non-conformity, being out of step with dominant patterns and practices of domination, exploitation, or dehumanization, right? Being transformed by the renewing of our minds so that we may then engage in the process of discernment of what it is that we are to be doing, what is good and acceptable and perfect, right? So liberation theology is not really grounded in a kind of moral or political um, clarity about what specifically all of us need to do, but rather it's a certain kind of posture, it's an orientation, it's a style of responding to the presence of God in history, and specifically the presence of God, God's presence and activity, and God's own purposes at work in the reality of the least of these, those Matthew 25 was talking about, the life of the most vulnerable. So that process of discernment is essential from the apostle here in Romans 12, this idea that discernment is part of a posture of non-conformity and presenting our embodied lives in a certain way in the world. And that this all has to do with the quality of which we worship God in spirit and in truth. We looked at the Psalms for some more biblical roots for liberation theology. Uh, I didn't even comment on it last week, but just the opening theme of thankfulness, which the lectionary today is rife with the theme of gratitude. And when you look at Gutierrez's work, Classic Meditation on the Book of Job, God talking the innocent of suffering, honestly, it is this reality and necessity of gratitude to God and awareness of who God is and God's goodness, extravagance, abundance, transcendence of anything we can imagine as human beings or any good we might expect, right? It's the fullness of the reality of God, and God's goodness, um, towards everyone, the universality of God's love. That is the first intuition of liberation theology, which leads to the first act being one of, as we'll talk about with Gutierrez in a minute, of gratitude, contemplation, adoration, silence, awareness of the mystery, the gravity of what we're presented with when we even dare to think or utter a word like God. So the Psalms begins in gratitude. Psalm 9, I will tell of what you have done. I will be glad and exult in you and praise your name. Uh, for when my enemies turned back, they perished and stumbled. That theme of stumbling is important. Um, Sin being kind of its own punishment, and sinful, we as human beings, when we come together and engage in sinful patterns and practices in the world, that itself has a kind of regressive or dehumanizing effect on everyone involved, right? That causes us to stumble on our way through life. So we see this image in the Psalms emerging throughout. Let them get caught in the traps they have made, right? Um, so that idea of stumbling here, right? The enemies of the psalmist are those who are caught up in their own schemes. They're worried about themselves. That means they have an inhuman relationship with God and others, and they are walking a path that leads to destruction, confusion, error, idolatry, right? Not a livable path. So that theme is there in the Psalms as well, which I didn't really speak on last week. You have maintained my just cause. You have sat on your throne giving righteous judgment. I spoke a lot about the centrality of judgment last week and the connection between God's judgment and God's present attention to human history and the demand of justice, right? The need for right relationships. You have rebuked the nations on this basis, right? For what you have established your throne for judging justly the peoples and nations. You destroyed the wicked, blotted out their name. I spoke last week about how the judgment of God targets right? Not human beings, not the rich and the oppressed themselves, but the little kingdoms we build up, right? So our enemies have vanished, not as human beings, but their cities, right? The kingdoms they made for themselves, God's judgment brings them into everlasting ruin, meaning permanent abolition of unjust institutions and social structures, right? There's cities you have rooted out. I talked last week about connections with the book of Zephaniah and the lectionary reading there, that God attacks the firm foundations of the nations, of the proud and the rich. The very memory of them has perished. For the Lord sits enthroned forever. God has established God's throne for judgment. And if anyone has questions about the connection there between that language of God being an eternal judge, or right, God is always the judge, and what God is doing as judge, right, that the throne is established for judgment. God judges the peoples with righteousness and equity. And then again, the central language of the Lord being a stronghold for the rest. So those who know your name, the one who has just been revealed as such, right, who know their name, they put their trust in you, not in themselves and their own schemes and plans. For God avenges blood. He is mindful of the poor and does not forget the cry of the afflicted. So the idea of the Lord, God in God's self being a stronghold for the oppressed, and taking seriously what that language might mean for us, to think about God being present as not just an inner or spiritual refuge, but as going back to that imagery of the good shepherd, right? What does the shepherd do? Provides good pasture, food, nourishment, shelter, protection. This is the language of God as a stronghold that liberation theology is taking, perhaps with the severity that other traditions, which minimize or downplay the earthly and social reality of what it means for God to be a stronghold, right? And either internalize or eternalize that idea of God as a stronghold. That is the central challenge that liberation theology puts forward, coming out of these biblical, basic biblical themes about God's universal love for everyone, God's provision and care through um, human society, through the earth, our being embodied creatures on the earth, that God provides for everyone, loves everyone, and that God's preferential response, right, or attentive response to an imbalance that we create, right? That is the basis of God's judgment and God's decisive action and response in human history to unjust situations. So we talked again a little bit about Psalm 10 carrying this theme forward, that the problem for the psalmist, as for Job, if you read Gutierrez's book on Job, or you've listened to the great lectures on Job we've had recently, the problem is one of perceiving God's presence, right? Or learning how to discern and name God's presence in the midst of realities which actually do contradict the very nature and promise of God. Who God says God is, and what God says God is about, what God says this world is, and what we should be about. Right? It's realities that actually do contradict those things, the truth and the claim of God, according to the Christian tradition. Right? So the problem of God's presence or nearness, God being hidden or revealed, that is a central problem in the reality of the poor for liberation theology. And then we talked about this central idea that the specific kind of atheism, of denial of God, that the psalmist rejects is not one that is solely or even primarily an intellectual matter of believing or convincing oneself, right, with certain language and philosophical reassurances that there is a higher being. That's really a monotheistic discourse, which is not always or even necessarily a Christian one, right? If we don't specify the connection between Christian theology and those other monotheistic traditions. But there's a specific kind of atheism. We could call it a practical or a social atheism, which is denied, which is recognized by liberation theology and spelled out here in the Psalms, right? The proud, the rich, those who scorn the poor and deride the poor and demean them, those who build up themselves on the backs of others, right? that wickedness that God's judges, that kind of boasting, that kind of greed for gain that curses and renounces the Lord, right? In their pride, they say in their hearts, all their thoughts are, there is no God, and God will not seek it out, right? There is no one with power and authority around to hold me and my tribe to account for what, not just what we have done, but for our response or lack of response to who we are in this time and place, right? To the reality of our life as it actually stands in relationship to the least of these and the lost sheep, right? The lean, those who are being starved and killed and exploited and oppressed. That is the central heartbeat, the biblical heartbeat of what liberation theology is about, attacking that specific kind of atheism, which of course leads us to say that part of the challenge, the real challenge of liberation theology to Christian theology more broadly, is that it actually is a critique of Christian idolatry itself, right? That's a key point. Okay. So I'm happy to talk about that more, but I wanted to lay out some of those biblical roots of liberation theology. And then just the final thought from Psalm 10, the reality of evil. Their ways prosper at all times. That's an acknowledgement in scripture, right? That there is a kind of effectiveness and reality of wicked ways, of evil patterns of behavior, evil relationships, right? Unjust institutions. These are things that God and God's self takes seriously, and that Christians and all people concerned with justice and the kind of spiritual and moral human roots of any social justice concern, we have to take that seriously, the reality of evil. And this is precisely just to make another connection to Job. Um, this is one of the failures of Job's friends, as Dr. Vasely laid out, right? It's not taking seriously the reality and gravity of evil that Job is actually wrestling with and doesn't know how to speak and respond to, right? So Job's first response is silence, where the theologians want to talk about God and suffering in a way that explains, internalizes, or eternalizes, right? And doesn't deal with the present reality, uh, the injustice, the ungodliness of social situations that we are part and parcel of and complicit in, that we did not create, but that our life is shaped by, and that God is claiming us through that relationship that we actually have to our neighbors, to the poor and the most vulnerable in our midst. Right? So liberation theology with the Psalms denies the specific kind of practical or social atheism that there is no God around with power and authority to hold the unjust to account in human history, and this reminder of the reality of evil, that it is prosperous. If you're after certain things, you're only going to get there, right, in certain ways. But it's this thought that we shall not be moved throughout all generations. We shall not meet adversity. And I could get into all kinds of topical and anecdotal situations, but I mean, just think about how we as American Christians, for instance, part and parcel of our denial about the historical roots of our society itself, the United States of America, as coming into existence through fundamental processes of theft, genocide, right, conquest of land. If this is the historical roots of our society, and we can even begin to conceive of the United States as an imperial power, right, as an empire, and we know that all empires fall, right? Um, it it's just a thought experiment. Think, how many Christians do you know, right, who will proclaim faith in God and a sure future with God, an eternal relationship with God, and be confident in that faith that that is their destiny, but cannot imagine the end of the United States of America or the end of our dominant social systems like capitalism, right, or imperialism, just as a way of nations being in the world. Right? So what would it mean for a specific kind of practical or social atheism that is confident and so proud that it says there's no God around with power and authority to judge, to intervene and change the situation, right? To confuse the plans of the rich and uphold and the hope of the poor. Um, and to say to ourselves, as a society, as a nation, as a culture, as a people, we shall not be moved throughout all generations. We shall not meet adversity. That's a deep theological challenge that the Psalms poses to us in our present day context. Not to put too fine. Okay, so and then finally, just before I move into some new material, recapping still from last week, we talked about Gutierrez mentioning different types of poverty, which I'm going to say a bit more in a second. And these two central theses for liberation theology in Latin America that come out of the Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council, focused on the church being the church of the poor, right? The church is and wants to be. So there's a recognition of the reality of the church, but also an aspiration that we are not yet the church of everyone, and especially the church of the poor in the way that we should be. And the necessity of discernment, discerning the signs of the times. Gutierrez roots the liberation theological task of discernment in that biblical exegetical challenge, right? How do we, do we fall in the same camp today in our thought that nothing can change, none of the dominant patterns and institutions will ever, can ever be reformed or undone and abolished, right? We're never going to be able to deal with police brutality or American hubris on the world stage, right? Liberation theology challenges us to discern the signs of the times and to be more confident and courageous in our historical judgment about God's presence in our lives, right? Than confident in a relationship that we have with God just inside of ourselves or off somewhere when we die, right? Liberation theology is encouraging us to engage in that tricky, very difficult, but very necessary historical task of discernment. Okay, so I want to actually stop and play a clip here as we round out the second half of the lesson. I don't see any questions. Again, if anybody's got questions and answers, please submit them through Q&A. I'll try to take note of chat too. So I'm going to try to bring up a video clip of Gutierrez talking about the reality of poverty. Okay, so you all should be able to hear this in just a second. Turn up the audio. And I do have the closed captions here. I'm going to play about 3-4 minutes of this is Gustavo Gutierrez talking a few years ago at this 21st Century Center Boston College conference, telling his kind of giving an autobiographical account of the origins of liberation theology. And he's just finished talking about how racism was a problem in Latin America, obviously, that that liberation theology was also responding to. So he's talking about the interconnection between different forms of what he calls poverty. And this will help us clarify what he means by the distinction between different types of poverty and how liberation theology understands and evaluates those different types of Okay, I was just seeing y'all's notes about the sound not coming through. I don't know if I've got time to go back and change that. I hope you could see the. I hope you guys could see the captions at least maybe in those couple of minutes. I apologize for that. Thought I had that set up correctly. But so just to kind of recap, I appreciate y'all letting me know. I'm just going to stop sharing that screen and not worry about that. And there wasn't any captions either. Okay. Um, okay. Well, what I'll do, I apologize for that, guys. Then I had the captions there up on the screen. It was showing on mine, but I'm not sure why that wouldn't have come through at least. Um, anyway, I guess I had a setting off. Nathan and I had tried to work that out, but anyway, I apologize for that. So I'll send you guys the link to that, or provide in the chat here, and make sure when you guys get the slides that you have that link that you can go back and look, and I'll provide the minutes there. Okay, you can see the captions, Keenan. Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay. So what Gutierrez was saying there was talking about the connection between liberation theology responding to different forms of oppression in Latin America, dealing with racial injustice and also essentially, he says, and crucially, gender hierarchy, gender discrimination, right? The silencing of or lack of attention and dehumanization and marginalization of women. So the base communities in Latin America out of which liberation theology emerged were not just responding to class or economic issues, and that's a very important point, right? They're responding to the the full humanity of oppressed peoples, right, in all aspects of the human condition. A focus on material poverty, or what Gutierrez calls socioeconomic poverty, is still central, right? But it's not exhaustive or exclusionary of other forms of poverty, because again, the reality of the situation that liberation theology is trying to attend to is how is God present and attentive and active to the lives of these good and valuable children of God, dignified children of God, in ways that are the dominant patterns of our lives, the social institutions and ideologies which actually shape how we see ourselves, interact with the world, and interact with one another. How did those patterns and practices, right, uh, miss and leave out and ignore the goodness of these fully human beings? The creation of material poverty, we talked about last week with the spread of modern colonialism, right? The rise of a global capitalist system where access to the very sustenance of life, food, water, becomes increasingly tied to a wage, to money, right? That is a very specific historical kind of reality. And so the key thing in that quote, in that clip from Gutierrez that I was trying to share with you all and failed on the audio there, was, I hope at least some of you could see it, was Gutierrez saying the central fact is that poverty is a human made uh, outcome, right? That we have created poverty, and that's a very, just outside of theology, outside of religion, just from a historical perspective, that is a central point to reckon with. That the kinds of poverty that is an affront to who God is and who we are, who others are, all of us as children of God, the kind of poverty that's an affront to that theological reality and relationship between humanity and God, um, is one that poses blocks, obstacles, obfuscates the very clear and transparent relationship of God and presence of God to human history through things like the provision of food, the sustenance of life. Think back to that language from Ezekiel, right? What does it mean that God is a good shepherd? If that's not just God leading us individually, internally, but providing for God's children, right? Caring for creaturely life itself. If that is the central That's the central relationship of God. That's why Gutierrez says in that clip that poverty um, is is a sin. It is an outcome a fact of sin that we have caused, because this kind of poverty is created through specific kind of social relationships, through specific kinds of political and social and economic systems, ways of organizing our common life. Um, and that is an affront to God because of who God is in relationship to. So I'm gonna get back into my last couple of slides here, and then hopefully you guys will have some questions for me. I haven't seen any come up yet. So there are two basic intuitions that Gutierrez lays out about liberation theology, and the first is methodological. Theology is language about a mystery. And again, I don't think we should understand that as mystery in the sense of something that is simply far beyond human beings to comprehend, although Gutierrez would say that as well. And if you go back and look at his book on Job, and he says this all the time, Gutierrez says this all the time, that these central intuitions of liberation theology, he thinks are just classic Christian theological intuitions coming straight out of Thomas Aquinas, right? And the teaching of the Christian church with that especially those traditions that have placed mysticism, contemplation, a kind of a self-critical and um, um, self-distancing, self-decentering, right? Other-centering methodological practice. So God is a mystery for Gutierrez in the same way that God was for Aquinas, both in the sense of being incomprehensible and beyond just human, beyond creation itself, beyond our powers, of limited human powers of cognition and comprehension, but also in the sense that God is comes to us as judge, as a universal carer, as a shepherd who is in God's self, paying attention to and responding to history in specific ways that we have to follow. So the mystery has to do with the newness and surprise and the judgment of God, the otherness of God, not just God being beyond human comprehension. So the first act for liberation theology is an act of silence and contemplation, as well as an act of solidarity, which Gutierrez says is itself a kind of silence. To put oneself, look at that language from Romans 12, to take a posture in the world of being a living embodied sacrifice, to stand in the world in a certain way, to commit to being in the world in a certain way. That is an act of practical silence. That discourse about God, intellectual and cognitive discourse, is itself grounded in that sort of spirit and posture, Gutierrez says. So the second intuition then is one of historical judgment, grounded in this meditative, contemplative adoration of God and God's goodness towards all of us, and that commitment to the other as a child of God, of equal standing and value as everyone else, right? That's the first act. And the second one is one of historical judgment. Liberation theology proceeds on the basis of faith that God is actually present and active in and for the life of the poor. So we have these claims from the Medellin Conference in 1968. Poverty is inhumane and anti-evangelical. And Gutierrez says the preferential option for the poor is itself a theocentric option centered in God. So this quote kind of wraps up the clip I was trying to share a minute ago. The poor are loved preferentially by God, not because they are good, but because they are poor, because they live in a condition that is contrary to God's will. So I hope you can see from my presentation that there's both a theological judgment and a historical judgment that liberation theology is making. And that is the central methodological insight of liberation theology, and why it's a challenge to all forms of Christian theology and Christian proclamation. So you guys will have my slides, and you can see kind of the rest of what I got here. We could talk through it for hours. I'll pause and see if there's any. Pause and see if there's any comments or questions. Stephen says self-decentering of praise. I think if you're saying self-decentering is a kind of praise, praise of God, absolutely, right? To praise the other in a sense, right? God. But yeah, it's also that willingness to be historically self-critical, Stephen. I think that that is important, and that's why I think liberation theology is a challenge to other forms of theology that would, of course, say and in a real sense be not about, you know, the preacher or the pastor or the theologian themselves, but about the object of speech, the object of study, God, right? But it's awareness of God's presence and reality in our lives, in our actual relationships with others. That's that's the key, because in a weird sense, that does mean we have to attend to history and attend to the reality of our present situation to ourselves in a self-critical way, which is a different move than simply talking about God as this reified symbolic other, right? Does that make sense, Stephen? Okay, Jack says, so how do we stand in solidarity with the poor? Do I give to panhandlers? Do I champion the poor? If so, how? That's a great question, Jack. I appreciate that. Um, I mean, on the question, just as a side note, on the question of giving to panhandlers, look up Dr. Gathke has a short piece about how to give to the homeless or if to give to the homeless. If anybody else knows the piece I'm talking about and wants to put the link or the title there in the chat from Dr. Gathke, it came out, I think, that he published or wrote for somewhere this past year. Check that out because that's a great, Dr. Gathke in that piece shows you that when we're dealing with these kinds of ethical questions, what do I do, right? How do I respond to injustice? What do I do? Um, it's not really a matter of coming up with universal rights and wrongs or specific rules for all places and all times, right? So the question of do I give to the homeless? Do I give to people who beg? I mean, well, first of all, there are scriptures that that address that, right? Give without asking anything in return. Whatsoever you do to the least of these. So all that is there. Uh, Nathan shared the Dr. Gathke article, Rules for Addressing Panhandlers. Um, Right. And Keenan says, do what's on your heart. Well, my point is this is the challenge of liberation theology, right? The central challenge is to come before God with a self-critical and open spirit, and to do so in attention to our present reality, meaning attending to the situation of the poor. We have to be willing to engage in, well, first of all, right, to listen to and be attentive to the cry of the poor, right? So liberation theology is really grounded in a kind of lament, attention to the cry of the poor. Paul talks about the groaning of creation under the weight of sin itself. If poverty is the result of sin, of a deep-seated, violent and unjust and ungodly relationship, if it comes about in the world through sin, then the cry that emerges out of living in the midst of that sinful reality, living a contradiction of who you are as a good child of God, that God, the good shepherd, is providing for you, right? But somehow your life isn't provided for, you're not cared for, right? It's not a matter of what we as individuals do to specific poor people, but how we see ourselves in relationship to others. That is the key challenge, right? So it's good to do what's on our heart, but our hearts have to be uh, shaped, informed, right? So that we are not going along like the psalmist, the fools who say in their heart, well, I haven't done anything wrong and there's no one around to hold us to account. There's no one around who's paying attention to what's really happening through the creation, the social construction of real world poverty, the denial of basic provision and care, right? So getting clear about what's going on is the first step of solidarity with the poor, I think, Jack. And again, that's grounded in these two different acts of meditation and contemplation, but also being willing to make a historical judgment and having some historical awareness and sensitivity, right? So if we can't imagine a world um, where people aren't materially poor, but we can't imagine a future where we're happy with God, we need to ask ourselves, what is our hope in and what are we attending to? Right? And another challenge just out of the Bible would be how do we interpret that line from the Gospels themselves, Gospels itself, where Jesus says, "You will always have the poor with you," right? Does that mean we accept the dominant notions about what poverty is and how it's created? Are we conformed to the dominant ideologies about poverty that says, well, if people are poor, at the end of the day, it's on them, right? It's their fault. And so we're always going to have poor people around because, there's always going to be lazy bums who want handouts around who don't want to work, you know? Is that our answer? Or is Jesus challenging us to say, right? You will all there human nature and human beings are such that some of you are always going to be getting over on the backs of somebody else, that sometimes are the foundations of our societies and civilizations, the might and power and prowess of our economy and nation state itself is grounded in this fundamental relationship of getting over on someone else, building up status and wealth for ourselves on the backs of others, right? Um, so we have to be attentive to that, and not let our hearts be formed by the fool's denial of that practical and social atheism, which says God is not involved in the creation of this poverty. God isn't here, and God isn't challenging us and claiming us to think about where poverty itself comes from and what it is as an assault to who God is and God's relationship to all of us. Right. Thank you, Keenan. Groaning due to living against how God wants us to. Job showed that some things aren't our fault. And that's the key thing. Please go back and look at Gutierrez's it's a little book on Job, and it's a classic meditation on what theology itself is about, because that's what the subtitle is God Talk and the Suffering of the Innocent, right? And Gutierrez's claim is that what Job knows that Job's friends don't know, right? Is that the suffering that meets Job, the violence that is confronting Job, the loss, right? The denial of provision and care from a good shepherd, that is actually a contradiction of the will of God. That's what Job knows and won't give up on, even if it means arguing with and critiquing and condemning the dominant image of God, his own perception of God, and the image of God of his friends, right? Engaging in that critique of idolatry. Job is willing to take that step because he's grounded in that first act of meditation and contemplation, and is in touch and aware that he becomes aware that his situation is the situation of the poor. And that is the situation in which the claim and promise of God is actually tested and discerned, right? Okay, guys, it's 10 o'clock. I don't see any more questions and comments. I really appreciate y'all engaging, and I apologize for the technical difficulty there. Thank you all so much. Please tune in to Dr. Mitzi Miner's presentations on the New Testament and Christmas miracles and wonders the next couple of weeks. Thanks so much for supporting me, guys. Follow me, message me, get in touch with me if you want to hear more from me. And please keep track of and support the work of MTS in this venture with Sunday morning seminaries and in general. Thank you, guys. God bless.